The first time I realized something was wrong happened on an ordinary morning while I was waiting for my coffee before heading into work. For years, I had gotten into the habit of checking the savings account my sister and I shared. It wasn't because I was obsessed with the balance or worried about the money. I simply enjoyed seeing our progress. That account represented one of the biggest dreams we had ever worked toward together. For almost 4 years, we had been setting aside money every month with the goal of opening our own business. We had postponed vacations, passed on expensive purchases, and made countless sacrifices to build that fund. Every time I saw the balance increase, I felt like we were getting closer to turning years of planning into reality. That morning, I opened the banking app expecting to see the same thing I always saw. Instead, the moment the balance appeared on my screen, I felt something tighten in my stomach. At first, I thought I had misread the numbers. I closed the app, reopened it, and checked again. Then I checked a third time. The number didn't change. A huge amount of money was gone. My first assumption was that the app was displaying incorrect information. Banking systems sometimes make mistakes, and temporary glitches happen more often than people realize. Trying to stay calm, I opened the transaction history to see if there was some explanation. That's when I found several transfers I didn't recognize. These weren't small purchases or routine expenses. They were significant withdrawals that had taken place over the previous few weeks. The most alarming part was that I hadn't authorized any of them. I remember exactly how I felt in that moment, because it wasn't fear and it wasn't anger. It was confusion. There was a simple explanation available, or at least that's what I believed. My sister had access to the account just like I did. If anyone knew what had happened, it would be her. So I immediately picked up my phone and called her. If you enjoy stories about family betrayals, hidden secrets, financial deception, and people who eventually face the consequences of their own actions, subscribe to Unspoken Truth, because we share stories like this every single day. Daniela answered with the same relaxed tone she always used. For the first few seconds, I honestly thought the situation would be resolved within minutes. I asked whether she had looked at the account recently, and there was a brief pause before she responded. It wasn't a long silence, but it was noticeable enough that I remember it even now. She told me she hadn't seen anything unusual and asked what was wrong. When I explained that a large amount of money was missing, something happened that didn't seem important at the time but would later become one of the details I couldn't stop thinking about. Before asking how much money had disappeared or what transactions I had found, she immediately told me it was probably a banking error. Her response felt a little strange, but not strange enough to make me suspect her. After all, this was my sister. Daniela wasn't just a close family member. She had been one of my best friends for most of my life. We had grown up together, gone through family problems together, celebrated achievements together, and supported each other through difficult times. The idea that she might be hiding something from me never seriously crossed my mind. Over the following days, I focused on dealing directly with the bank. I made phone calls, reviewed account records, and spoke with multiple representatives until I finally received information that seemed to clarify part of the mystery. According to the bank, the transfers had been initiated from one of the authorized devices connected to the account. That meant this wasn't the result of an outside hacker or an unknown third party. As far as the bank was concerned, the transactions appeared completely legitimate. When I heard that, I assumed everything would become much simpler. If the transfers were legitimate, then Daniela would surely be able to explain them. But when I spoke to her again, I noticed something that began creating an uncomfortable feeling I couldn't quite ignore. She insisted she didn't recognize the transactions either. She claimed she was just as confused as I was. She suggested someone might have gained access to her information and even floated the possibility that the bank had made a mistake somewhere in its records. On the surface, her explanations sounded reasonable. The problem was the way she delivered them. Every time I asked a specific question, her answers became vague. Every time I tried to focus on details, she found a way to shift the conversation elsewhere. And every time I mentioned the exact amount of money that had disappeared, I could hear tension creeping into her voice. Even then, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. There were too many years of trust between us to throw them away because of a feeling. I kept telling myself that I was overreacting and, for a while, I managed to believe it. Then something happened a few weeks later that changed everything. We had scheduled a meeting to continue discussing plans for our future business. We had been researching possible locations and wanted to review some financial projections before moving forward. Daniela arrived late that day, which was unusual for her. From the moment she walked in, I noticed she seemed distracted. She kept checking her phone and barely paid attention to the conversation. Several times she asked me to repeat things I had just said because she hadn't been listening. At one point, she received a call and quickly stepped away to answer it. Her phone remained on the table in front of me. I wasn't trying to look at it, and I certainly wasn't snooping. But a notification appeared on the screen, and I happened to glance at it before it disappeared. I only saw a few words, but they stayed with me for the rest of the day. The notification mentioned a property deed being finalized. At the time, I didn't fully understand what it meant, but I knew one thing. As far as I was aware, Daniela wasn't buying property. When she returned, I casually asked what the notification was about. Her reaction was immediate. She grabbed her phone, locked the screen, and told me it was something work-related. What stood out wasn't the answer itself. It was how quickly it came. The explanation sounded prepared, almost rehearsed. For the first time since all of this had started, I felt genuine suspicion. That evening, I tried convincing myself I was imagining things. I reminded myself that coincidences happen and that one notification didn't prove anything. But the more I thought about the missing money, her evasive answers, and that strange message about a property deed, the harder it became to ignore the possibility forming in the back of my mind. The next morning, I made a decision I never imagined I would have to make. I started investigating my own sister. My goal wasn't to prove she had done something wrong. In fact, it was the opposite. I wanted to find evidence that would prove my suspicions were ridiculous. I wanted to discover a perfectly reasonable explanation that would allow me to trust her completely again. But as the days passed, I began finding small pieces of information that all pointed in the same direction. None of them were conclusive on their own, but together they started forming a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. What I didn't know at the time was that my investigation was about to uncover something far worse than I had imagined. The missing money hadn't disappeared because of a banking error. It hadn't been stolen by an outside scammer. It hadn't vanished because of some administrative mistake. The money had been used for something very specific. And when I finally discovered what Daniela had spent it on, I realized that the person I had trusted most for nearly my entire life had been lying directly to my face for weeks. Over the following days, I continued gathering information without telling Daniela what I had discovered. Part of me was still desperately searching for an innocent explanation. I wanted to prove myself wrong. I wanted to find evidence that would explain the missing money without destroying the trust we had spent a lifetime building. But the deeper I looked, the harder it became to ignore what was right in front of me. I started researching public property records because the notification I had seen on her phone kept replaying in my mind. At first, I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. I simply needed to understand why someone who supposedly couldn't afford a major investment had suddenly been connected to a property deed. For several days, my search led nowhere. There were moments when I considered stopping altogether because every step felt wrong. Investigating my own sister wasn't something I had ever imagined doing. Every document I opened made me feel guilty, as if I were betraying her trust. But then I would remember the missing money, and the guilt would be replaced by the same unanswered questions that had been keeping me awake at night. Eventually, I found something that changed everything. One afternoon, while reviewing recently registered property transactions, I came across a name that immediately caught my attention. At first, I assumed it had to be a coincidence. The last thing I expected was to actually find Daniela connected to any real estate purchase. But as I continued verifying the information, every doubt disappeared. The records clearly showed that she had purchased an apartment only a few weeks earlier. I remember staring at the screen for several minutes without moving because the discovery made no sense. Daniela didn't have enough money to buy property on her own. That was one of the reasons we had spent years saving together in the first place. Neither of us was in a financial position to make a major investment independently. Yet there it was, documented in black and white. My sister had purchased an apartment at almost exactly the same time that a large amount of money had vanished from her shared account. Even then, I knew I couldn't confront her yet. The apartment raised serious questions, but it wasn't direct proof that she had used our money to pay for it. The timing looked suspicious, and the circumstances were difficult to ignore, but suspicion wasn't enough. If I was going to accuse my sister of something this serious, I needed certainty. So I kept digging. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing changes in her behavior that I probably would have ignored in the past. She became harder to reach. She took longer to answer messages. Meetings related to our future business were suddenly postponed or cancelled altogether. What stood out the most was the complete shift in her attitude toward the project that had once meant everything to both of us. For years, Daniela had been the one pushing us forward. She was always talking about opening the business sooner, making bigger plans, and finding ways to accelerate our timeline. Now she seemed strangely uninterested. Every conversation about the future was met with hesitation, delays, or excuses. One evening, I decided to ask her directly when she thought we would finally be ready to move forward with the business. There was an awkward pause before she answered. Then she told me that maybe we should wait a little longer. According to her, the economy wasn't in the right place, the risks were too high, and we needed to be more cautious before making any major decisions. The explanation surprised me because it sounded nothing like the Daniela I had known for years. When I asked more questions, she continued talking about financial uncertainty and the importance of being patient, but the more she spoke, the more I felt that she wasn't actually explaining anything. It sounded like someone trying to buy time. For the first time, I seriously considered the possibility that she wasn't looking for a solution. She was looking for a way to postpone the moment when I would discover the truth. A few days later, something happened that completely changed my perspective. An old coworker who knew both Daniela and me invited me to meet up with a few mutual friends. During the conversation, the topic of real estate came up, and without realizing what he was about to reveal, he casually asked what I thought about Daniela's new apartment. The question caught me completely off guard. For a moment, I didn't even know how to respond. Trying to remain calm, I asked what he meant. He immediately began talking about the property as though it were common knowledge. He told me that Daniela had shown photos of the apartment to several people, that she seemed extremely excited about the purchase, and that she was already discussing renovation plans. As I listened, I felt a mixture of disbelief and anger building inside me. It wasn't just that she had bought the apartment. It was the realization that she had chosen to hide it specifically from me while openly discussing it with other people. That night, I barely slept. I kept asking myself the same question over and over again. If Daniela had purchased the apartment legitimately, why keep it a secret? There was no logical reason to hide something like that from me. We were sisters. We had shared nearly everything throughout our lives. If she had somehow managed to buy a property through her own efforts, I would have been one of the first people she told. The more I thought about it, the more obvious the answer became. Daniela knew exactly where the money had come from, and she knew that if I learned about the apartment, I would eventually connect the dots. That was why she had hidden it. That was why every conversation about the future had suddenly become uncomfortable. That was why she seemed so determined to delay our plans. She wasn't protecting a surprise. She was protecting a secret. The following morning, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to wait any longer. Using the information I had gathered during the previous weeks, I located the exact address of the apartment and drove there myself. The entire trip felt surreal. Part of me still hoped that somehow everything would make sense once I arrived. But the moment I saw the building, that hope started to disappear. It was a beautiful property located in an area far beyond what I knew Daniela could realistically afford. As I stood there looking at it, I couldn't stop thinking about the numbers I had been reviewing for weeks. The estimated value of the apartment lined up almost perfectly with the amount of money that had disappeared from our shared account. The closer I looked, the more impossible it became to dismiss the connection. Standing outside that building, I realized I was much closer to the truth than I had ever expected to be. What I didn't know yet was that Daniela had made a mistake. In her rush to complete the purchase, she had left behind a financial trail that would eventually destroy every explanation she planned to give me. And once I uncovered that evidence, there would be no way for her to deny what she had done. Over the next several days, I focused on gathering enough evidence to eliminate any remaining doubt. After finding the apartment and realizing how closely its value matched the amount that had disappeared from our shared account, I was no longer dealing with vague suspicions. I was looking for confirmation. As painful as it was to admit, I needed proof strong enough to withstand every excuse, every explanation, and every attempt to shift responsibility. Daniela was my sister, and part of me still wanted to believe there was some missing piece of the story that would make everything less terrible than it seemed. But the more documents I reviewed and the more information I uncovered, the harder it became to hold on to that hope. Eventually, I found exactly what I had been searching for. Among the records connected to the property purchase, I discovered information regarding the down payment used to secure the apartment. I didn't have access to every financial detail, but I found enough to establish something incredibly important. The timing matched perfectly. One of the largest transfers that had disappeared from our shared account had occurred during the exact same period in which the down payment was made. It wasn't a rough estimate or a coincidence that required interpretation. The dates lined up, the amounts were nearly identical, and for the first time I could clearly see the connection between the missing money and the property Daniela had been hiding from me. For several days after that discovery, I struggled with what to do next. The anger was obvious, but underneath it was a level of disappointment that felt even heavier. If a stranger had stolen that money, I would have focused entirely on recovering it. What made the situation so painful was the fact that the person responsible was someone I had trusted for my entire life. I found myself replaying old conversations in my head, remembering years of plans we had made together and all the times we had talked about the future business we wanted to build. Looking back, those memories felt different now. For the first time, I started wondering when the lies had actually begun. I wasn't just thinking about the missing money. I was wondering when Daniela had decided that her personal goals mattered more than the dream we had spent years building together. Eventually, I called her and asked if we could meet. I didn't explain why. I simply told her there were some things we needed to discuss. She agreed without hesitation, and we arranged to meet at a small cafe we had both visited countless times over the years. I remember sitting there before she arrived, staring out the window and mentally rehearsing the conversation again and again. No matter how many times I imagined it, I couldn't prepare myself for the reality of what was about to happen. When Daniela finally walked through the door and sat across from me, she smiled as if nothing was wrong. For several minutes we talked about ordinary things. Work, family, daily life. I listened to her speak while wondering how someone could hide something so significant and still behave as though everything were normal. Eventually, I stopped pretending and asked the question directly. I wanted to know when she had planned to tell me about the apartment. The effect was immediate. Her expression changed before she even spoke. I could see her trying to process the situation and figure out how much I already knew. After a few uncomfortable seconds, she told me that she had intended to tell me eventually but had been waiting until everything was finalized. The explanation sounded weak the moment it left her mouth. I asked how she had managed to afford the property. That was when the contradictions began. First, she talked about personal savings. Then she mentioned financing options. A few minutes later, she suggested that someone had helped her temporarily. Every explanation was different from the one before it, and none of them matched the information I had already uncovered. The more she talked, the clearer it became that she was improvising. At that point, I placed the documents I had collected on the table between us. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't create a scene. I simply showed her the records, the dates, the transfers, and the evidence connecting the missing money to the apartment purchase. I'll never forget the moment she realized she could no longer talk her way out of it. She looked down at the documents and sat silently for several seconds. Then she finally admitted what had happened. According to her, she had always intended to pay the money back. She claimed that the apartment opportunity had appeared unexpectedly and that she couldn't afford to miss it. She insisted that she had only borrowed the money temporarily and that she planned to replace every dollar before I ever noticed it was gone. As I listened to her explanation, I realized something that hurt even more than the theft itself. Even at that moment, she still wasn't fully accepting responsibility for what she had done. She talked about circumstances, opportunities, timing, and financial pressure, but she never truly addressed the betrayal. She seemed focused on explaining why she had taken the money rather than acknowledging that she had knowingly used years of shared savings for her own benefit without my knowledge or consent. She kept repeating that she never intended to hurt me, but every word felt empty. She had weeks to tell me the truth. She had countless opportunities to be honest. Instead, she chose to lie repeatedly while continuing to hide the apartment and pretend that nothing had happened. The conversation deteriorated quickly after that. Once she realized I wasn't going to accept her explanations, she became defensive. At one point, she even suggested that I was overreacting because she had planned to repay the money eventually. Hearing that was almost unbelievable. It showed just how differently we viewed the situation. For Daniela, the problem seemed to be that she had been caught. For me, the problem was that she had broken the trust that our entire relationship had been built on. The money mattered, of course, but it was no longer the most important issue. What hurt the most was knowing that she had looked me in the eye for weeks and continued lying while benefiting from something we had spent years creating together. The months that followed were filled with lawyers, financial records, and conversations I never imagined having with my own sister. Fortunately, Daniela had made several mistakes during the purchase process. In her rush to secure the apartment, she left behind a clear paper trail that connected the property directly to the transfers from her shared account. Those records ultimately became impossible to dispute. Every document, every transaction, and every timeline pointed to the same conclusion. The money used to purchase the apartment had come from the account we built together. Eventually, I was able to recover a significant portion of the funds, but by then the damage extended far beyond finances. The legal issues were eventually resolved, but our relationship never recovered. Some members of our family encouraged me to forgive her quickly because she was still my sister. Others argued that recovering the money should have been enough to move on. What those people failed to understand was that the financial loss had never been the deepest wound. The real damage came from discovering that someone I trusted completely was capable of deceiving me for her own benefit. Recovering money is difficult, but rebuilding trust after a betrayal like that is something else entirely. Looking back now, I realize that the greatest loss wasn't the money itself. Money can be earned again. Businesses can be rebuilt. Plans can be changed. What I lost was the certainty that family loyalty automatically guarantees honesty. Before all of this happened, I believed that some relationships existed beyond the need for caution. Daniela taught me otherwise. She got the apartment she wanted, but she lost something far more valuable in the process. Even today, people occasionally ask whether we'll ever have the relationship we once had. My answer is always the same. Some mistakes can be corrected. Some debts can be repaid. But there are certain betrayals that permanently change the way you see a person. And once that happens, no amount of time can bring things back to what they were before.